Hello, my name is Mike Driscoll, and today I want to talk to you about creating GUIs with PySimpleGUI. So, what is PySimpleGUI anyway? PySimpleGUI is kind of a new package on graphical user interfaces for Python. Some people call it the Python GUI for humans. And basically what it does is it wraps other Python GUIs and it makes interfacing with them simpler. So whereas in other GUIs you have to think about, using object-oriented programming, creating classes and subclasses for each of your widgets. You sometimes have to put stuff into different kinds of containers to arrange your widgets on screen. With PySimpleGUI, you basically use Python data types. So when you're creating a layout of widgets, you might use a list of lists, for example. That's what makes PySimpleGUI different, is that it wraps other GUIs and it makes it simpler to use it and design one. So let's talk a little bit about the differences between GUI frameworks. And GUI stands for Graphical User Interface, in case you didn't know. The main differences between them are the licensing requirements. They have different naming conventions for pretty much everything. Although most GUI frameworks use widgets to describe the items you see on screen, like the buttons, tabs, text boxes, etc. PySimpleGUI is a little bit different in that it calls those elements instead of widgets. Most frameworks use object-oriented programming versus functional programming. PySimpleGUI uses functional programming for the most part. And a lot of them draw their widgets. They don't use the actual native widgets for the platform that they're running on. So if you look at Linux, Mac, and Windows, you'll note that their buttons and their text boxes have their own look and feel. And that's because those tend to be native. So you'll especially see this in Microsoft products versus Apple products. You can see immediately that they just look like they belong on that operating system. And then you'll see other applications that don't look quite right. And the reason they don't look quite right is because someone has spent the effort to create custom widgets, or they're using a toolkit that doesn't use native widgets, it uses hand-drawn widgets, and so the widgets just look different. It's all up to you which one you end up choosing. PySimpleGUI, because it wraps 4 different GUI toolkits, you can actually change what it's doing. So by default, it uses tkinter, which comes with Python. So when you pip install PySimpleGUI, you'll get the tkinter version. You can specifically say you want to get the PySide, WX or Remy version if you want. If you do that, you can get like native widgets. Like WX uses native widgets. PySide and tkinter draw their own widgets. tkinter, for the most part, doesn't try to look native. It does have TTK, which is a subset of their widgets that does look more native and more clean to most developers, while PySide does attempt to look native. So if you want your app to look native, you might want to use PySimpleGUI Qt or PySimpleGUI WX to get that native look and feel. The nice thing about PySimpleGUI is that you can do it all in tkinter first, and then you just change the import at the top from import PySimpleGUI to import PySimpleGUI Qt or PySimpleGUI WX, and it'll just change all the widgets to use the other GUI toolkits widgets. And your app will look more native or not, depending on your choice. I've never actually tried the Remy port, but it makes a web app out of your application. Worth a try, but I haven't tried it enough, and I don't know how well supported that one is. I haven't heard a lot about it. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about PySimpleGUI. It wraps the entirety of tkinter, which comes with Python. And when I say it wraps the entirety of it, I mean it wraps every single widget that comes with tkinter. I can't say that about all of the toolkits that PySimpleGUI wraps. So tkinter wraps it in its entirety. PySide, it wraps, I think it's like 90%, maybe 95%. It wraps most of it. It definitely has all the core widgets of PySide. And WX I don't know where it's at on that one, but I know it doesn't wrap everything in there. And I don't think the current maintainers are planning to wrap the entirety of WX especially since it hasn't had a lot of development love the past couple of years. Okay, let's talk about installation. To install PySimpleGUI, you simply do python 3-m pip install PySimpleGUI, and you might want to do this in a virtual environment just so you can play around with it and see if you like it. Let's create a simple app using PySimpleGUI. So, everyone likes Hello World, so let's create a Hello World with PySimpleGUI. It takes 2 lines of code. Import PySimpleGUI as SG. This is a pretty standard way of doing an import with PySimpleGUI. It's kind of following what data science developers are doing with NumPy and Pandas. They're importing, Pandas as PD or NumPy as NP. So with PySimpleGUI, you import as SG, so you don't have to type as much. Next, we create a window. So what you're seeing here in my Firefox is a window. This whole dialog is kind of a window. Then we set the title. So in my case, I have a title here. In my Firefox, in our PySimpleGUI, we're going to have a title called Hello World in our app. Layout is empty because we're not going to add any elements or widgets. This sets the size of the window, and .read just says, hey, let's read the event loop and try to capture any events. So when we run it, you get this little tiny Hello World box. And you can see the title's there. There's no widgets inside of it, or no elements inside of it, but you do have a minimize and an exit button automatically added for you. All right, let's create something a little bit more interesting by adding a button element. So I added more code than it was necessary to add a button element, but I kind of wanted to show you what a more standard bit of code would look like in PySimpleGUI. So first, we import PySimpleGUI again, and then we create a layout. So as you can see, it's a list of lists. Inside of it, we have sg.text, which is basically a label, hello from PySimpleGUI. Then we create a button, and it's just sg.button, and you put OK as the text label for the button. And because each of these are inside of their own list, they'll get stacked vertically. So this will go on top, and this will go underneath it, and they'll both be centered automatically, I believe. Then we do window, and we pass in our layout from there to there. So now we have a little demo instead of Hello World. Then we create our event loop. So now instead of that just saying window.read, we're going to check often, what events have been fired. So if I hit the OK button, it's going to read OK, and if event equals OK, it's going to close the dialog because it'll break out of the event loop and drop down to window.close. Let's give this one a try. Okay, so it didn't center. I thought it did, but it doesn't center by default. You can make it center though. Anyway, if I hit OK, it closes the dialog and I have to rerun the code and pop it back up again. Or I can just hit the exit button. Either way works. So that's nice. And it works the way it's supposed to. You'll notice not printing out anything in my Jupyter notebook like the previous example did, because this time we're actually saying window.close, whereas the other one, it was killing it in a slightly different manner. All right, let's talk about laying out elements. Each GUI toolkit does it differently, or at least it has a slightly different term, even if they're similar. So Daybreak's Python, or Wix Python, uses what are called sizers, which allow you to put your widgets inside of a sizer, and then when you resize your frame, the buttons will resize appropriately, or the text boxes will resize appropriately as you change the size of your dialog or window. The same thing happens with layouts in PyQt and PySide, and geometry managers is the term that tkinter likes to use. PySimpleGUI simply uses lists of lists, and by default, PySimpleGUI doesn't let you resize the window. These do let you resize by default, mostly, unless you're creating a special type of dialog. All right. To create a horizontal layout, I'm going to show you how to use a list comprehension with PySimpleGUI, because I think it's just fun. And it also shows you the power and simplicity of PySimpleGUI. So here we're going to create a layout. I'm going to add basically a button with a number on it, for a number in range 1 through 6, which will give me 5 buttons. And because all of these buttons are appearing in a single list, it will be laid out horizontally from left to right. Then we'll create our window with the layout and do everything the same. And this time, so that I can make the buttons work, I went ahead and said OK number 2. So what does this look like? Ta-da! Demo. OK 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. None of these buttons work except for OK2, which I have mapped here. We'll close the dialog. We could change it and say, let's make it OK 5 and rerun it. And now 2 doesn't do anything, but 5 does. So, that's a simple way to create an event and an event loop and change it up. By default, I think I should mention that SG buttons will map to their unique label. So if you end up having buttons with the same label on it, you need to specify the event name, which I'll show you in another example. But in this case, because I made all of the buttons unique, it's easy to just say button 5 or OK 5 will close the dialog. All right, let's continue and talk about vertical layouts. This time I'm not going to use a list comprehension. We're just going to put in some buttons. So here we go. This one has 2 widgets for the first row, 1 widget for the second row, 1 widget for the third and fourth and fifth. And so what we end up with is a bunch of vertical widgets. Because these elements are within single item lists of lists. So we end up with that. It's a nice way to lay out your widgets, and you can kind of see it even just looking at the code. If you put in the line breaks appropriately, you can kind of see this matches exactly with what is drawn on screen. So it kind of even in your head you can kind of see it. You're going to have an OK button hello with OK2, OK3, OK4, and OK5 underneath each other all the way down. So the code matches what's on your display. All right. Let's talk about creating columns. Creating columns is another way to arrange the elements on your window. This is a little bit too big. All right, here we go. So import as SG. We're going to create a list of lists here, and this is going to be my left-hand column. So I have a left-hand column of widgets and a right-hand column of widgets on the right. The left-hand one will have a label, an input text box. That's what an input is. I'm going to enable events, and here is where you set the name of the event to look for. In this case, I'm going to look for dash fname dash. So before we were talking about buttons having their own unique labels being a way to catch an event. So button 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. We could set those here. We could also say if event equals dash fname dash, then we can grab the input that people are typing into our text dialog. Then we got a folder browse button, and you know what buttons are. To use a column, you just do sg.column and pass in your list of lists. We'll slap a V separator between them, or a vertical separator, and then create the right column. When we run this code, you get this dialog. And so you can see, because these items are all together in a single list, they go horizontally across. Whereas these are 2 sets of lists. So we have 2 rows of buttons. And none of these widgets are hooked up, except for browse, which is hooked up automatically to the open dialog, or the folder browse dialog, I mean. Because we have it set to folder browse, this one already has its own events that we don't even have to catch. It just does it for us automatically. So there you have it, a bunch of different ways to lay out the elements in your PySimpleGUI window. So I wanted to just do a quick comparison of PySimpleGUI and WXPython, because I was using them both for my book, Pillow Image Processing with Python. In that book, at the end of each chapter, I wanted to create a little GUI that would allow you to apply different pillow functions to images. So if I wanted to resize an image, or apply contrast or brightness effects or other filters to my images, I could do so without typing code. I just do it within a GUI. And originally I was going to do it with WXPython until I discovered PySimpleGUI could do it with about half the number of lines of code. So let's switch over to my program here, and I think I need to switch projects. So we'll just jump on down to Python Pillow, and we'll look at these little bits of code here. So here's a much more complex image converter that I created with PySimpleGUI. It's got a lot more imports than what you've seen so far. But overall, it follows the same idea. I put the actual GUI code inside of a main function just to make it more standardized for the way I like to program. Here's our layout, a little bit more complex than what you've seen. I've run black on it, which is why it's kind of has a different look than my previous code did. But you can still see, this is probably going to be the top widget. Then we're going to have a row of widgets and another row of widgets and then a button at the bottom. We're going to pass that to our image converter window. And then we have our event loop where I catch different events. So you can see I check for the exit event, the load image and effects event, the save and file name event, etc. Let's run this and make sure see what it looks like. So this is what this program looks like. We have a nice blank area to load an image into. Let's see if we can find an image quick to put in there. Let's see. We'll just put some flowers in there. Hit load image. So this is what that looks like when it has an image loaded. And we can just play with different effects and it'll automatically apply them. This code ends up running at about 78 lines of code. In WX Python land, we end up with, I believe, 157 lines of code. So a little more than double what we had with PSG or PySimpleGUI. Part of that's probably my fault. I probably could clean this up a little bit, but a lot of it is due to the boilerplate that comes with WX Python. And what I mean by boilerplate is you have to add some overhead with these sizers. You create your sizer, and then you have to call sizer.add for each widget that you want to add to the sizer. And normally you have more than one sizer. So down here I have a box sizer that I add widgets to, and then that gets added to the main sizer. So every time you call .add, that adds another line of code to your code. And there's bind free sequences here. So button.bind. In PySimpleGUI, you don't have to tell it to bind anything because the bind is done implicitly using the key, or if it's a button, it's load image, unless you want to set the key explicitly, which we could do here. So right there, you're just doing it all in one step, whereas in WX Python, it's a two-step process of creating the button and then binding the button, and so you just end up with lots of extra code. On the other hand, when you run this code, in my opinion, this looks much more native than the other version did. And it has some niceties. I think it does a decent job of loading up a little bit better. I think it's a little bit faster than using PySimpleGUI for this particular project, but it took a lot longer to code. So, it's trade-offs. And like I said, WX Python hasn't had a release in a couple of years. So it's a much slower development cycle for WX Python. All right, let's continue here. Using Matplotlib with PySimpleGUI. So Matplotlib is supported because Matplotlib works with tkinter. It also works with WX Python, and I believe it also works with Qt. So to use Matplotlib with those different GUI toolkits, you have to import the correct backend. In this case, we do backend.tk, import the figure, and then we can start drawing our plots. So here we're just drawing a plot into Matplotlib. To actually get it into tkinter, though, or PySimpleGUI in this case, we need to tell it to use tk, and then we have to draw it. So let's scroll down a little bit and find out what the heck we're doing here. So in this layout, we have a widget, the mysterious canvas object, and the button. The canvas is what we're going to draw our plot on, our Matplotlib or graph on. To do so, we create our window with our layout, and then down here we do draw figure, window, canvas, tk canvas. So what that's doing is we're using the dash canvas dash key to say we're going to pass our canvas and the TK version of that canvas to the draw figure. And that figure is going to use the TK-egg converter function that comes from Matplotlib to allow us to draw the figure on our canvas. And so it'll draw it and it'll return it, and everything should be hunky-dory. So let's go ahead and run it, and we should see a nice little sine wave appear. There we go. Looks cool. And now we just added Matplotlib to PySimpleGUI. As you might expect, this also works with Seaborn if you'd like to rather use Seaborn instead of Matplotlib. You use the same code, basically, because you still need to use the backend TK-egg, because, you know, Seaborn's built on top of Matplotlib, but then you can use Seaborn instead of Matplot. Alright. There are lots of other examples on the PySimpleGUI website. If we can get this to load properly, I'll show you a few of them. The PySimpleGUI has lots of ways to customize the toolbar. They have different ways of creating more polished windows, so you can create games like Uno or chess. You can create lots of windows. There's some more Matplotlib stuff. It supports 32 different color themes, which you can kind of see here. Lots of other game examples. This is a good example of using OpenCV or computer vision with PySimpleGUI, PyWindows. Anyway, the point of this is there's a ton of cool examples. And there's also a big demo programs thing that they have on GitHub. So a lot of those examples that I just showed you, although not all of them, at least I don't think they are listed in the in the demo program subfolder of the PySimpleGUI GitHub page. So you can go in here and you can see there's hundreds of them in here, and they're fun. I think they do have a license on them, so they're a good starting point. But you really need to rewrite them for yourself to use them properly. All right. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments, and let me know what you'd like me to create next time for my next video. Thanks so much for watching.